For those of you who are here this week and weren't here last week, my name is Greg Whistler. I'm one of the managing principal brokers here at Premier Property Group. I've been managing for the company for 2 years. I've been licensed in real estate for 23. And my partner in crime, the princess of all reviewing brokers back in the back, Barb Roach, with many more years of experience and management experience than I could ever dream of having, is here to help me out and make sure that I do a good job with this. Okay, a couple of things that I love to do. First, if you are not a mentee and you're here for education, raise your hand. You're an existing broker who's getting some extra education. So mentees, look around. These are people that care enough that they're wanting to keep themselves fresh on the latest and greatest. They're wanting to have an ever-evolving understanding of how to present these documents to their clients and what's in these documents. So, just a word of encouragement. Once you think you know it all, you don't. Okay. Second thing, for you that are mentees and in the program, last week we had some homework. We asked that you print off and read through the sales agreement, that you print off and read through the listing contract, that you practice using those documents. My suggestion was, sell yourself your home, list your home. So this is the all points of honesty moment. How many of us did the homework? All right, we got a couple of people that did the homework. For those of you who didn't have time to do the homework, we'll give you the benefit of the doubt and assume that you were too busy talking to buyers and sellers, which is cool, but we don't assign the homework to you to be mean. We assign it to you because we want you to be the best with these documents that you can be, and there isn't a way to be the best that you can be with these documents unless you live with these documents. You got to read them. You got to be able to put in your own words all of that blah-bitty-blah that I said for 2 hours last week. Okay? So I would encourage you, if you didn't get a chance to get that homework done last week, carve out some time and do it this week. Okay? Okay. Today we're going to be talking about the stages of the sale. We've written out that sales agreement. Buyers found a house. We've made an offer. Where do we go from here? Stuff like that. So, part of that buyer finding the house stuff is talking with them about it before, because hopefully you haven't put them in your car and hauled them around town until you, one, know what they want, so that you aren't showing them the wrong stuff all the time. If they want one level and you're showing them split levels and tri-levels and other stuff like that, they're not going to be happy to work with you if you don't seem to understand what they're looking for. So you should be talking with them about their goals and dreams. You should be having them with Directors Mortgage, maybe the Irwin team or somebody else, or whatever your favorite lender is or whatever their favorite lender is. You should be getting them pre-approved before you load them in the car. I'm sure Barb will be shaking her head as I say this, but there is nothing worse than showing a buyer $300,000 houses, and then when you get pen to paper, you find out they're only qualified for $250,000 worth of house. It's even worse because now $250,000 doesn't look nice because $300,000 was what they wanted. So find out what they qualify for. Talk with them about their goals and dreams. Get on the same page with them about what they're doing. One of the things that we will be asking you for in the paperwork is that you do a CMA. Greg, do I have to do a CMA? Well, if we're truly the professional guiding them and counseling them on what things are worth, are they getting a good buy? We should be doing a CMA as part of that. Now in this helter-skelter marketplace, there isn't always time to do it right up front. But at some point during the early stages of it being a pending sale, you could go back and do that homework and say, hey, just wanted you to know, here's the comps, and it looks like you did okay. Or, maybe we're on the edge, but it's really the home you wanted, so maybe it turns out okay. But you should be talking with them about it. The best example that I can give you is a couple years ago, I had a buyer that was qualified up to, I think 275 or something like that. And we had looked around for houses and we found the right one. It happened to be a bank-owned home and it was at about 2 1/4. So we knew that we were probably going to have a little bit of competition, and we ended up having a lot of competition. And, you know, as you've all experienced, or at least heard somebody have the experience, they said, give us your highest and best. And my first-time home buyer said to me, Craig, what do we offer to win this? We want to win this house. What's the right price that's going to get it for us? You know, we can pay more, but we don't want to pay too much. So we did a CMA, and the CMA said, well, it's probably worth about $250. And we offered $251, and they got it. And then when the appraisal came back, I think it came back at about $257. So they were like, yeah, right on. Get it right out of the park. They were pleased all around. But they wouldn't have made a $251 offer on $226 as first-time home buyers without that homework having been done. So, so that homework's worth doing if you can carve out the time to do it. Okay, so we're going to write the offer. We're going to identify the terms. We talked a little bit through the offer last week, but you know, I mean, as we saw in that document, we're identifying the terms, the earnest money, what personal property needs to be left, closing date, possession, escrow, things like that. You know, why I wanted you to read that contract is so you can explain that contract to them and be able to put it in your own words, because it's just always easier than sitting there and reading it line by line. You'll know you've really got it good when you can explain it to them with the contract facing them and it's upside down to you. So, although with you guys and your electronic paperwork, you don't do upside down contracts probably as much anymore. Barb and I used to sit across the table from them with a tri-carbon document, and you know, we had to read it upside down to explain it to them while they were looking at it right side up. Anyways, but you're asking them questions, making sure they're understanding what they're reading, what you're explaining to them. I call it getting the glassy look out of their eyes before they sign the document. So, questions on any of that so far? Just kind of reviewing and refreshing. This is a big part of when you get into that agreed to and, you know, mutually accepted offer is managing timelines. And if you're working with the transaction coordinator, they're kind of laying out some sheet for you of that. Here's the timelines that I see in the contract, and you're double checking that. But hopefully you're also sharing that document with the cooperating broker and with your buyer so that they can know and confirm that they're expecting the same timelines you are. There's nothing worse than having a professional inspection timeline and you think the date is this date and they think the date is maybe a day earlier or something like that. So it's always good to be discussing those timelines and things like that in advance. So, but just keeping track of those things. You know, I'm probably writing them down on a piece of paper or using that paper that my TC is giving me. Maybe you're making yourself a note on your calendar in Google Calendar or Zip Notes or whatever the latest and greatest app is for keeping track of notes and timelines and things like that. But you should be reminding yourself about these things. And it's not really enough to remind yourself just about when the date is, when that 10th day is of, you know, your inspection time period is done. It would be good to have yourself a reminder a couple of days ahead, because there's nothing worse than having a conversation, and I think we talked about this a little bit last week, you know, at 3 o'clock on the afternoon when you've got a 5 o'clock deadline on that last inspection day for the home inspection period, you know, and now you're calling your reviewing broker, what do I do, what do I do? And we're saying, well, a couple of days ago, you probably should have been talking with that other agent about, do we need to extend this deadline? You know, maybe a day or two ago, you should have said, all right, to your buyer, all right, we're getting close to this deadline. Now, here are the options as we meet that deadline. What do you want to do? Because remember, we only act on the instructions of our principals. So, you know, the buyer should be telling us, you know, if they aren't giving us these repairs, we want out. You know, so, but you should be having that conversation with them before those last 2 hours so that they're not feeling extra panicked, which always puts a strain on our relationship with our clients. Does that make sense? All right. Okay. You know, at some point in the process, you're going to as you get closed in on closing, you're going to be reviewing the closing statement. So, but yeah, so you should be getting one of those from escrow. But primarily today we're going to dive into the OREF addendums that we're going to use during the sale of a house. And then we're going to get into the special PPG forms as we have time at the end. So, any questions before I dive right into those? All right, okay. Just a reminder real quick, special shout out and thanks to Lawyers Title back in the back. Jen, thank you so much for getting this all scheduled and keeping track of our credit hours and stuff like that. The company has a good relationship with Lawyers Title. We don't require you to use them, but I'd encourage you to throw an escrow their way whenever you can. I was using them before I came to PPG. I've always gotten great service. That's just my little speech for them. Directors does a great job too. I haven't worked directly with the Irwin team, but I can tell you that, okay, we've got good results back there, but I've always seen impressive work when I've had a director's loan officer in those transactions. So if you've got somebody else you're using, great, but consider having directors as a backup plan.
Or you're knocking it out of the park if you got both on your team.
There you go, boom.
I mean, yeah.
All right. Let's start off with a form that Barb and I see very few people use. If I can get it to load. Might have to go back to my hotspot. That's the exclusive buyer service agreement. So, I guess the best way I can describe this document in just a generic term, if we go and we sell a house, we sign a listing contract to work with that seller. And we won't work with that seller any other way. We got to have a listing contract. We won't just work with them on their word and a handshake. We got to have it in writing. We got to spell out the terms. The exclusive buyer service agreement is the same thing except for buyers. And you've got to have it, if you want to protect yourself when you're working with buyers. I'm sure, the mentees, you probably haven't had enough experience with this yet, but us experienced agents, I'm sure we've each at least had one experience where we've been working with a buyer without a contract, and then that buyer kind of goes dark on us, and the next thing we know, they've bought a property with some other realtor. They've started working with some other realtor. And maybe it wasn't meant to be, but you got a better chance of protecting yourself and protecting your paycheck if you've got a service agreement with them. So, now, side note, you got to explain the document to them. You can't just give it to them in DocuSign and hope that they sign it and then say, yes, I've got a commission locked in. You got to help them understand what they're signing, because if you don't explain it to them, and then you try to collect, the state's going to say, well, you didn't explain the document. How can you expect them to know what they were signing? And they're not going to enforce it for you. So, okay. So, Section 1 spells out the duties of the broker. We're going to make our best effort. The way I'm explaining it, again, like last week, this is kind of the way I explain these documents to my clients. So, we're going to make our best effort to find that property based on the information they've told us about what their dream home is. We're going to use that to find properties that are in the MLS and maybe also not in the MLS. Maybe we're talking to our Lawyers Title team and saying, hey, I need a mailer in Happy Valley that is this many bedrooms, this many bathrooms, in this approximate tax value that I'm fingers crossed hopes will get close to my price range, so I can mail them a letter and say, hey, I've got a buyer looking for a home, like yours, would you consider selling? If you can't find something in the multiple listing system, talk with your title people about maybe how you can get extra, extra opportunities. Add to that.
She's a brand new PPG agent. She probably started 6 months ago. She just closed her second deal in the last 3 weeks. And her first deal is because she was getting the FSBO list from us, for sale by owners, because she has buyers in like Molalla and Oregon City, but lower price range. And so she just went through that FSBO list and started knocking on doors and finding people. And she's closed 2 deals now. So that's a good different avenues, especially those lower price points or areas that are harder to come by, even if they are higher price points, but, you know, there's multiple offers on everything. That's something that she's had a lot of success with, so.
Yeah.
And that's something that we send out every Monday.
Sometimes those out-of-the-box ideas will get you that closing that you need when you're having a hard time finding something in the MLS, or when you're always competing against 12 other offers against stuff that you're finding in the MLS. So we're going to do whatever we can to find them a property. So there's a notification here to the buyers, you know, a buyer notification, you know, pursuant to the Code of Ethics, you know, we advise them of the following, that unless the principal broker and buyer agrees, it is the principal broker's policy to cooperate with other realtors in the showing of properties and sharing compensation. So it's just a little bit of an explanation there about, you know, how we interact, you know, with other realtors and things like that, how we're paid, that kind of stuff. We get down into the agreement to hire a server. You know, the buyer is hiring the buyer's agent. Buyer's agent agrees to assist the buyer in locating a property and be compensated as follows. Commission shall be up to blank percent of the purchase price set forth in the real estate sales agreement, reduced by any commissions received from the broker through the seller or the seller's agent. So if you've got a buyer service contract, and on that line there, what is that, line 21, you've put in a commission equal to 3%. All right, you show them the house in the RMLS, and the RMLS says, you know, the other agent says, we're paying you 2.5. So if you've got this set at 3, you'd, you know, effectively be able to ask your buyer for an extra 0.5% above what's being offered to you from the cooperating agent. Do you have to ask them for that extra 0.5%? No, but you have the ability to, if you've got it spelled out here in a service agreement. If you don't have a signed service agreement, you're taking whatever's offered to you by that other agent. We just recently had a manager's retreat, and among the conversations that we were talking about was the downward pressure on our commissions, especially in this environment where everything's so active and competitive. We have a lot of services that we offer at Premier Property Group. We have a lot of great marketing, we have a lot of great tools and things like that. But in a lack of, for those agents that don't have our tools and stuff like that, what can they offer the seller to set themselves apart? A lower price. And a lot of times, unfortunately, that part of that lower price gets passed on to us in the buyer agent commission, because if they've got a lower starting price point for themselves, they've got less to share with us. So there's a little bit of an ability to protect your paycheck here. But there's also, like I said, you've got the option to charge it. You've got the option to be forgiving and just accept what's offered to you as compensation. But if you don't have it in writing, you can only take what you get. Go ahead, Barb.
You talk to your reviewing broker if this is going to come up, but there is verbiage that you can use to where you're asking the seller to pay the buyer's closing costs, including that extra 5%. That's the only time that you can renegotiate the commission, is if you have a service contract and it's part of the buyer's closing costs.
I'm going to guess that that's in sample verbiage in the broker toolkit?
I hope so.
All right. If it's not, we're going to put it there. Okay. So you can do that. You can do a flat rate commission where you enter a flat dollar amount. If you're doing a flat dollar rate commission, you need to have a conversation with your reviewing broker before you do that, because our company policy is anything less than 2.5% to our side, you need to have a conversation about. So usually we'll be cooperative with you. There's 2.25s and 2s in the multiple listing system, so we're going to work with you when that's the compensation offered. But before you're signing one of these agreements, you should be talking with us so we can talk with you about what should be in there when possible. I'd say for a flat fee, the very least that we would say, and Barb I think mentioned it last week, was $2,500, because if you get sued and we've got an E&O claim, your cost out of pocket on that E&O deductible is going to be $2,500. So you should at least have as much money coming in as might, worst case scenario, go out. So, but you're worth more than that. So talk with your reviewing broker so that we can coach you up on tips to how to protect your paycheck in that scenario, okay? Or line 24, you can fill in the blank. I think line 21 does a pretty good job of covering what would be in line 24. So if you're working in line 24, maybe you're talking with your reviewing broker about that too, okay? The principal broker will or will not require a payment by the buyer in advance, a non-refundable retainer fee. We don't really see retainer fees all that often, but there are a few agents out there that I've seen do one. There was a pretty high producing agent in our former company who used to charge a retaining fee on all the transactions that she and her team did. So, you know, you can do that if you feel like maybe there's going to be some upfront costs that you're going to have to incur, but most times, you know, you're going to be in a will not charge scenario. You know, a reminder to the buyer that the agreed upon commission will be paid to the broker if the buyer acquires the property of interest through a tax deferred exchange. And the reason that they're talking about that is because it's usually the exchange company that's buying the property in the client's name. So it's just a reminder, you know, that's not a workaround for the payment that you would owe the agent for finding something. But it's also, you know, if a property is acquired through a lease with an option to buy, then there's a couple items that are spelled out here. You know, you can check the first box. When the lease and option are signed by all parties, your commission would be due. 1/2 of your commission would be due when the lease and option are signed, and, you know, the other half when the option is exercised, or something different, and then you'd fill in that blank. I think typically we encourage that you would do at least half when you know, the documents are being mutually agreed to and put into play, and then the other half when it's, you know, being executed. You know, at least that is where we'd want you to be. So, okay.
So Greg, what happens if you don't have a buyer service agreement?
If you don't have a buyer service agreement,
How would that be paid out?
well, I mean, it would be paid out based on, you know, whatever. So what part of it? The lease option scenarios is what you're talking about? I suppose that those would be paid out based upon, you know, whatever agreement you put in writing when you're securing that lease option scenario. So
The listing agent would probably dictate that.
probably, yeah.
So that may or may not override what you have in the buyer agreement?
What the listing agent has agrees to. Barb, speak to that a little bit if you want to.
Okay. A listing agent would put in, if they're going to accept a lease option, how that would be paid out. Hopefully they would want to do it the same way. Your job is to have a discussion. When is this lease option to be paid out? Now, I see sometimes nothing gets paid until that option is picked up and it actually closes. That could be a year down the road.
Or
Okay.
more.
The only time you could get paid by the buyer for part of it up front is if you have your own contract with the buyer.
Right.
And I would if I was gonna do a lease option, because all the years of my business, I could count on this many hands, or fingers, how many times I've seen a lease option actually come to terms and pay out.
Right. So that's the reason you don't want to wait until the end.
Yeah.
The reality is that lease option scenarios are a pretty small portion of our business. I mean, I can probably count on that many fingers or less how many times I've actually had a buyer looking for a lease option. So most times this document's going to be about straight purchase.
There's a good reason why. Either the seller's saying, I'll take the lease option because this house won't qualify for financing, and he knows it. Or the buyer can't qualify right now for the financing, and they're hoping a year from now, they'll have straightened their credit out enough to be able to buy.
Yeah, usually there's
So,
something funky going on if we got a lease option going. So maybe another thing to say is if you're talking about a lease option, talk to your reviewing broker. So,
Talk about it. Come to it.
okay. Lines 34 through 39 talk about, you know, when a successful sale is deemed to have occurred, what the, so it's talking about, basically, yes, we've identified that right property and we're, moving forward. It's also deemed to have occurred within up to 180 days if not filled in after the term of this agreement. So basically, it's kind of that right to compensation thing like we had in the listing contract last week. You remember? So if we've introduced them to a property and they purchase that property during the term of this agreement or within up to 180 days or whatever you put in that blank after this agreement has ended, then we're entitled to some compensation for that. Basically what that's talking about.
What is a lot of people use these?
Does a lot of people use exclusive buyer service agreements? No.
Okay, so they're not required by PPG.
They're not required by PPG and they're not required by the state of Oregon. But what we'll tell you as reviewing brokers is you want to protect your paycheck,
Because
become
what's
real
happening-
familiar with
so
the
The
what's
stock.
Steve Nassar team
They-
doesn't work with any buyer, they don't get in their
They
car
make it-
unless they have
Because
this
what happens, you
in
guys,
place.
these buyers go out on the weekend because on a whim, they're driving around the neighborhood, they walk into an open house, especially new construction, it happens all the time, and they find their dream house, and the agent's like, oh my gosh, write it up right now, and all of a sudden they're in contract, and then Steve Nassar gets an email the next day, like, oh yeah, we bought a house, thanks for everything, we're buying this brand new house over here in Fulton, and he's like, excuse me, what?
Yeah.
So when you have this in place, it kind of helps secure that commission, but it also gives you that discussion with your clients that you don't work for free.
And, I mean,
They
it
don't
protects,
get
it protects your buyers from agents that would do that. Because if they're willing to do that, what else are they willing to do that's a little bit under the table and underhanded? But it also protects you from your buyers being in those situations because you can't be with your buyers all the time. So,
I got a question. If
Yeah.
you're buying like a FISBO for your buyers,
right.
you get paid from who?
You get
That's
paid
the
from the,
seller.
you get paid from the seller. So typically in their flyer or when your initial conversation with them, you'll have some sort of conversation about
But it's negotiable.
what is, are you paying a buyer's agent to bring a buyer? And they'll say yes or no, and it's not always. And so that's why you'd want to sit a service agreement is to have some sort of plan for who's
What
paying you.
this allows you to do is, you can go knock on the door of a for sale by owner and say, are you willing to pay my commission if I bring you a buyer and everything looks good to you? If they say absolutely not, if you have a service agreement with the buyer, you can go back to the buyer and say, I can write it up for you, but the seller will not pay your commission, or will not pay my commission, are you willing to? So, and obviously you have to have a good relationship, that's why it's important that this discussion, and I think we do a whole class on presenting this.
I believe there is one
We should.
that we've
If we're
done.
not, we will. But I think we do because presenting this is everything. The first time you meet a buyer, you can't just put this under their nose and say, well, I don't know you and you don't know me, but here, sign this agreement. So it needs a whole presentation around it, just like a whole presentation around going and asking the seller to list the house with you.
Right.
You have to prove to them that you're able to accomplish their goals, and same thing with the buyer.
Mhm.
I just had to interact with the seller and I told the agent, I'm sorry, the buyer is correct in this case. They signed a listing, a buyer broker agreement, and then the buyer agent actually went on vacation for 3 weeks and left that person hanging. And 2 houses came up that they felt that they should have had somebody showing them, and the agent did not do what the company policy says, that you have to have somebody cover for you. So, that's, if you're getting one of these signs, you have to do what you say you're gonna do. And, but you also say to the buyer, this is our contract. If you see something, you need to call me. So,
Okay,
I have a question.
yes.
So this provision is in here, so if the buyer wants to buy something after the term of the agreement, what is the general term of an agreement? I know it varies.
Well, we'll get to that on the next page, so let me put you on hold with that for a little bit. There's a representation here on 40 to 43, we've talked about our duties as agents, but it's also talking here now about, the buyer's responsibilities. I mean, yes, they do intend to purchase something, they're not, they intend to acquire it in their name. They,
will not be relying on contingent source of funds unless they let us know about it. You know, all of those sorts of things. Buyers will cooperate with us for timely review and evaluation of properties. So, you know, we call them up today and say, hey, there's a property, we really need to go see it. Well, it's Tuesday, I'm busy until Friday. Well, we know that that property is probably going to be gone. If they're doing that too many times, then they're not really abiding by what they agreed to. They're, you know, agreeing to go and look at stuff, you know, as timely as possible. And sometimes schedules won't work, but, you know, if they're doing it on every single property that's coming up, now we got a problem. So, here's your term of the agreement. So the term of the agreement begins on blank date and it ends on, you know, 5 p.m. on another date. So this is gonna be a negotiable item, but probably what's most typical, I mean, let me know if you're doing something different, experienced agents, but it's probably a, you know, a 3-month or a 6-month type term. Maybe it's as long as a year. Anybody doing anything different than 3, 6, 9, 12? What you got?
Well, my mentor has told me that he has his contracts expire 2 times a year,
Yeah,
the middle of the year and the end of the year.
right.
That way
So like
then-
June 30th, December 31st.
That's right. Then,
Okay.
so that's what I've done in a few contracts I've signed. That way then, essentially the way he describes it is that way I don't have to pay attention to when contracts expire. You just know that on these 2 dates, if some of them are then something's going to be potentially expiring.
Right.
Seems
So
to make sense.
if he was doing one of these right here and we're in the middle of August, he's either gonna run it through the end of the year or through June 30th of next year. So
Yeah.
it's gonna be somewhere between, you know, a little under 6 months or a little under a year is kind of what I'm
Yeah.
hearing the range.
I've
Anybody?
explained that to one of my clients. They said, well, we really want a 3-month contract. All right, fine, bring it up to 3 months.
Yeah. So it's a negotiable item, so you and the buyer are gonna come to agreement on what makes sense for everybody here. So. And then you've got in section 5, kind of the property of interest section. So when I'm doing these documents, to be honest with you, I'm kind of leaving this as broad as I possibly can. Because if I narrow the scope too much, then I'm, you know, maybe limiting where, you know, my service contract ends. You know, I mean, you know, I'm probably gonna check residential. I'm probably gonna put a price range on it. You know, I might describe a few areas, you know, but something like located in the vicinity of, you know, general vicinity of in 51, I mean, I'm licensed in the state of Oregon. If they see something in Oregon, I want the opportunity to show it to them. So, you know, I might be Oregon or I might be Portland metro area, something like that, you know, as far as broad. I mean, I just recently had a buyer that I picked up. They were originally looking in southeast Portland. They had to be near Powell Butte for grandkids. Now, we ended up in Gresham. We're really not that much farther than we were when they started looking, but our price range also changed. Their first house was $360. The one they're in contract on right now is, I think, $450. So, you know, I mean, a lot of things can change about these things. So, you know, you might consider keeping it a little on the broad side here in the property of interest. You know, and this is another spot that's at a discussion point. You and the buyer are going to agree on what's reasonable here. So.
Could you actually get in trouble by not making this broad enough? I mean, if I wrote down Portland Metro and they bought in Molalla, is there a legal issue
Yeah,
there?
yeah, I mean, there you might have a debate about is Molalla considered Portland metro area?
I mean, I guess the issue could be, as I'm thinking about this, if I put Portland Metro, then they bought in Molalla
Right,
with another agent,
yeah,
then they could say, well, you put Portland Metro, so your contract didn't extend to Molalla. Is
Right.
that the kind of thing that we're doing?
that's the
with
kind
it?
of thing we're talking about,
Okay.
so that's why your vicinity might be the state of Oregon.
Okay.
Yeah, if they go down and buy in Salem, you know, and you
That's
said
not-
Portland Metro, then you're probably not collecting on this contract, so,
Okay.
you know, so, you know, the rule of thumb that I default to is treat other people the way that I want to be treated. So, you know, you're gonna have a little bit of a discussion about this stuff, you're gonna, you know, it's gonna default to what's hopefully fair for everybody, okay? Clear as mud? Perfect. All right. Section 6 puts the clients on notice that you might be representing other clients in the exact same price range, which means you might be showing multiple clients the same house.
you might be making offers on behalf of multiple buyers, which is why we talked about last week in disclosed limited agency. One of the provisions that creates disclosed limited agency is when you're working with more than one buyer on the same property, okay? So that's just kind of putting them on notice about that. Section 7 is like any of our documents. We've got a dispute resolution. So if a dispute arose between the buyer and the principal broker, the company, over the terms of this contract, then we'd all agree to go through the realtor process of mediation and arbitration before we start suing each other. Okay? Section 8, the terms of this agreement are complete and final expression of the entire agreement between the buyer and the buyer's agent, the principal broker, and they can't be altered or modified without the agreement of the buyer and the broker. Okay? Then there's a spot for confidential information and a spot for additional provisions. So, but as was discussed earlier, this document is not really used enough. So I would really encourage you to try and make this part of your buyer packet and practice, because I'm going to predict the future for you. And I can't tell you that it's tomorrow or 5 or 10 years from now, but there will probably come a day when sellers pay the seller's agent and buyers pay the buyer's agent. Right now, we're all paid by what the seller's agent earns as a commission, and they share it with us. But there's probably a future where buyers are paying their own agent. So get ahead of the rest of the competition and become familiar with the document now. And the side benefit is you'll be protecting your commissions between now and then. Okay? Questions?
Would you mind clarifying line 25 one more time? I'm sorry.
Line 25. So that's where we're collecting a fee up front to serve them. So 25 through 27 is what we're talking about.
Yeah.
So if you felt like you would have expenses associated with, maybe you're collecting a non-refundable fee in advance, or, I mean, it's the equivalent of a security deposit. Barb, you want
I'm
to?
gonna throw out a circumstance.
Sure.
You're willing to sell these clients something down at the beach, which means you making a lot of trips to the beach. And that's the only place they're buying. They're buying a second home from you. You might want to take something up front to secure that, because you're gonna have expenses before they actually buy something. That's about the only time I've seen somebody put something in there.
Yeah.
Maybe you could think of another circumstance, but
The only other circumstance that comes to mind for me is just creating something that's a little bit more binding. When you've got your money, where your talk and your paperwork is, it, kind of cements the relationship a little bit. So, I was thinking of Peggy Hogue with, who charged, I believe she charged a fee on her buyer service agreements.
did.
And I can't think of what she would have charged for other than, tying that relationship
Because she
together a little
could.
tighter. Yep. See?
I
Exactly.
mean,
So,
bottom line is, you wanna work with me, this is what, yeah.
yeah. And there can be some of that. I'm not there, and I've done this for 23
Yeah.
years. I don't feel comfortable
The only time I
charging
would do
somebody a
it is
fee.
if they wanted me to go out of area where it was just gonna take, I could work with 10 buyers in the metro versus running down to the coast,
Right.
You probably would want to
constantly.
refer it out at that point.
I-
Unless
Yeah.
it was like a
That's-
personal, close friend,
Right,
family.
exactly,
Right.
exactly.
In that case, you're not charging a retainer anyway.
Yeah, true.
Possibly,
Did you
yeah.
have a comment or a question?
Yeah, question. So 21 through 24.
Yep.
Did that answer his question though? Okay.
Yeah.
How do you fill out 21, 22, and 24?
Sorry about that. 21 through 24, I'm probably checking the box on line 21, and
You
I'm
are.
probably putting something like 3% in there. Because if the, if the BAC pays, then I've got an option to do something like that. If the seller on a FSBO is paying, that's gonna cover that too. So does
So
that
do you
make sense?
feel, because obviously, again, I'm newer here, so it
Sure.
seems like most buyer's agent commissions are 2.5%.
Sure, so maybe you are putting a number in that blank that's 2.5%.
So do you put 3 even if you know it's gonna be potentially 2.5, because that's a little more typical?
I do, and then I give them a gift of, I'm not charging you extra, even though this is all they're paying.
Right.
I'm not gonna ask you to pay anymore.
Right.
But I want
Okay.
that as my backup and my option.
Yeah, particularly I want it as my backup and my option in case I'm showing them a for sale by owner.
Especially if they've been a year-long buyer. Difficult.
Okay.
But on a for sale by owner, let's be honest. The seller is saying, I'm not paying a commission on the listing side because I'm gonna do all that work. But truth be told,
You,
I'm gonna end up doing some of that work for them.
you do it all.
Because they're working a 9-to-5 job somewhere, and so they're gonna say, well, I can't let the appraiser in, but you can. Well, that's your job. No, it's now your job. So I'm gonna do more work, I'm gonna get a better than average compensation to do that. And then like Barb said, if the compensation is 2.5, I'm probably just gonna tell them, you know, I'll just take the 2.5, that's good enough for me. So, any other questions on that?
Yeah, I think that the template that is used says number 24, and it says according to the BAC on the listing.
That's what I've seen,
Yeah.
It
so.
throws in
Yeah,
something
you can
from
do
the
that
Facebook.
too.
You could do that too, but the problem is that if it's according to the BAC on the listing, then if you're showing them a for sale by owner, you got a big goose egg that you gotta have a conversation about. So that's why I'm doing line 21. Line 24 is not a bad way to go,
Do you deal
so.
with a lot of FISBOs?
Well, let's back up. There
no.
are some that won't do a FISBO, and they're only gonna show listed properties.
True, so it could be that case, so. I do for sale by owners when the need arises. So if I'm having trouble finding stuff, I'm probably calling lawyers for a for sale by owner list so I can find stuff that
Okay.
matches. I might be asking, Jen or Sybil to pull me a list in Gresham of homes that are in a certain price range because that's what my buyer's looking for. So, I mean, obviously they can't do price range because they're not listed, but they're gonna look on tax value that's kinda in the ballpark of that price range that we're approved for
Okay.
and hope that we find something that maybe fits. So,
Because it seems like if you're concerned with filling out 21 instead of 24 is a FISBO, I was under the impression that if you ever come across FISBO, you call them before you're even gonna bother showing your client and saying, are you gonna
You
even
would,
offer or not?
yeah.
yeah.
Offering a first-
Yeah, but if you don't have something in your your compensation section that talks about what you're gonna get paid if you're working with a for sale by owner,
Oh, okay.
then you've got a problem. So if you're gonna use line 24, that's fine. Just make sure that it says, what was the language that was in there?
That you'll take whatever the.
Oh, that whatever's
co-op
off-
Upon, yeah,
commission
agreed on
being
commission or
offered.
something, yeah.
So, I'll accept whatever's offered as the BAC in the multiple listing system or blank percent for a for sale by owner.
Okay. all right.
So, but then you've basically written out by hand everything that's already in line 21. So, I'm about less writing, so, but that's just me.
So I got a question.
Question here.
Yep. Go ahead.
I got a question. If you're working with a buyer
Uh-huh.
and you make an offer on a for sale by owner that refuses to pay the commission, and the buyer has to come out of his pocket with the commission, since this is based on ratios, won't that possibly mess with ratios up?
It could, and that's part of why Barb was saying earlier when we were talking about this document, that you're gonna be having a conversation with the buyer probably before you write that for sale by owner, because you're gonna be reminding them and informing them, I've talked with the seller, they're not gonna pay the commission, so the commission that we agreed to in here, you're gonna owe me. So we need to make sure that fits your budget before we put pen to paper on this one, and if it doesn't, well, maybe we're looking for another property. So, or you're going back to that seller and saying, oh, my folks really love your property, but because you won't pay my compensation, so maybe there's some extra efforts to try and get the seller to agree to do it, so. There's a way to get it done.
There is, yeah.
And if you're
That's a
having that
whole
struggle,
process.
if you're having that struggle, talk with your mentor and talk with your reviewing broker about that. Because I think Barb and I,
There are ways to go to a
Yeah.
seller and say,
yeah,
yeah.
totally. All right, let's move on, because we
Add it
spent,
on to the top of the price. I mean, there's ways to do it and get it done.
yep.
Yeah.
we spent a little too much time on that one, so I'm gonna kind of pick up the pace here. So we wrote the sales agreement, we talked about that last week, okay? We sent that over to the other agent. We talked with them, hopefully before they presented it, about the merits of our offer. And they liked it, except they didn't like all of it, so they made us a counteroffer, okay? So this is a seller counteroffer form, and it says up at the top, seller counteroffer number blank. So you're gonna number these, seller counteroffer number 1, number 2, number 3, buyer counteroffer 1, 2, 3. So, you know, I think one of my deals recently, I had seller counteroffer number 1, buyer counteroffer number 1, seller counteroffer number 2, buyer counteroffer number 2, seller counteroffer number 3. Hopefully, if you're getting that far into it, you've probably about got everything put together, but you're gonna number those. You know, addendums you might letter or name based on what what the issue is that you're addressing in it. But this counteroffer is to the sales agreement or to the buyer counter. You've got the parties to the transaction, the address, and then lines 5 and 6, basically what they say is that the seller agrees to sell the real and personal property based on the terms and conditions set forth in the sale agreement or any subsequent counteroffers, except what's changed on these lines that are coming next. So sales price is whatever, closing date is changed to whatever. You know, any of the terms that the seller wants to change, they're here. Otherwise, whatever was on the previous document is what we've agreed to it, okay? All right, and then there's a deadline for when it would expire, this counteroffer. You know, such and such a date, certain time, AM or PM, just like on the sales agreement. And like we talked about on the, you know, on the acceptance section of the sales agreement, I'm putting per listing agreement instead of 100% to seller, because I don't want to scare those buyers that, you know, might think they're going to lose their earnest money. You know, so, you know, we're either saying that forfeited earnest money is going 100% to the seller, or we're saying per the terms of our listing agreement where we already wrote out that it was going 100% to the seller.
So is that just talking about the original earnest money?
Yeah, so
Okay.
So I'm buying your house, I've put up $5,000 worth of earnest money, I've done all my contingencies, now I've decided, I don't want to buy your house. I just don't like the mortgage payment, or I don't like whatever, but I don't have any contingencies to get out. You know, I don't have any escape clauses left. So I'm forfeiting my earnest money, and so it's going 100% to the seller is the way we write our agreements. Clear as mud? Perfect.
Yeah, I think the last time I wrote that up, I wasn't sure what that was actually talking about, and someone said, yeah, just put 100% to seller.
Yep, okay, when in doubt. So there's a spot here on the seller counter for the buyer to accept the seller's counter. They do not accept and make a counter of their own, or they can reject the seller counter offer. Come on, respond. The buyer's counter offer works basically the same way, except this is the response from the buyer back to the seller. So it's basically the same as the seller counter offer, except that it's, you know, the buyer, you know, taking action. They're agreeing to all the terms of the sales agreement and subsequent counter offers, except what they modify in their buyer's counter. Maybe they're changing the price back. Maybe they're asking for some more closing costs or a different possession date, whatever. Oh, this is lovely. Okay. So we get far enough along that we've gotten agreement. And now one of those first timelines that's going on is the seller's sending over the property disclosures to you to get to your buyer. And hopefully we'll see these things one of these days.
Sorry.
Hey, at least somebody's getting Wi-Fi.
Hey Greg, I have a Wi-Fi if you want to try it.
I've got a hotspot too, I just can't get it to pick up. So, but if you guys are doing stuff on the Wi-Fi currently, if you could shut that off, that might help us out.
I'll do that right now.
Thank you, sir.
There you go. Maybe.
Okay. So the seller property disclosures, this is a 5-page document that the state of Oregon requires all sellers to fill out on residential property, so that's 4 units or less. There are a few exemptions to it. If it's brand new home, new construction, and it's never been lived in, they're exempt. They just need to put in the city or the building permit number in the city that issued it. If it's a financial institution that's selling the property, a bank, they're exempt. If the seller is, and notice the underline, court-appointed trustee, you know, a receiver, a personal representative, trustee, conservator, or guardian, then they can be exempt. And of course, transfers by a governmental agency, so the state of Oregon, HUD, things like that. So, but that court-appointed one is one that trips people up, and we will ask you for extra documents when you're turning in your listing. I've seen more than my fair share of people that have claimed the exemption under trustee, but when you really get down to it, it's a family living trust or something that they created with an attorney. It's not that, you know, we've got an estate situation where a judge has said, you're the trustee. So that's what we're looking for, is that document where a court has said, you're the trustee to whoever the seller is, okay? P.S. You can't be that representative, you as the agent,
Just
and
had
be the
that
agent.
come up yesterday.
So,
And an attorney
yeah.
for the client that is traveling out of the country actually suggested that she have her agent be the power of attorney and sign all the closing documents. I said, no way.
Translation,
Let that
conflict of
attorney be
interest.
the person.
Conflict of interest,
Oh.
okay.
I
So,
can't believe it.
as you read through these documents, it says for the seller to fill the documents out, so we're not doing it for them. I recently had my office manager in Gresham give me a phone call and say, Greg, I've got an agent sitting here at one of the help desks, and I can hear them reading the questions off from the seller property disclosure and filling in the boxes. Is that okay? No, do not do that, please. The seller needs to fill this out. And the state says that the buyers are entitled to a fully complete disclosure. So if you've got clients that are skipping over all the stuff that's not applicable, send them back and have them fill it out again. The spots that I see missed most often are line 41 and line 99, where it's just the only thing is it's not applicable. They miss it all the time. But we're going to, as reviewing brokers, kick this thing back to you if there are incomplete answers, because the buyers have the ability to send this back to the seller and say, it's not completed, please complete the document, and then when you send it back completed, then my timeline will start for my 5 business days. So we want to remove that option for your clients in the effort to protect our clients, okay?
Explain to your sellers when they're doing this, that one of the largest areas of suits that we see after the fact is where the buyer claims non-disclosure from the seller. Even though they had an inspection, even though they did things, they move in, something goes wrong, they go right back to this document and look to see if that seller might have missed something there. okay? So that's why we stress it so much. It's not just 'cause we wanna see you and your client doing more paperwork. It's because we know where lawsuits come from.
Right.
And you can never, ever, ever say this to the client. If they say, well, should I say this? You can never over disclose. We even have an addendum that you can add notes to.
Right.
So when in doubt, disclose,
Right.
okay?
So, and you'll notice that there are these yes answers with this little asterisk by them. That's where we automatically want some specific explanation for them. If they want to explain other things, they're certainly welcome to do that as well. But the seller's going to go through and say yes, no, unknown, not applicable on all of these questions. And then they're going to sign the bottom of each of the pages. When the buyer gets it, they're going to initial the bottom of each of the pages, and then they're going to sign here that they've received it. You, as the agent delivering it to the buyer, is going to fill out your name, the company name, and the date that you received it and started their 5-day time period, okay?
One question.
Yeah.
What if the buyer tries to file suit on something that was checked unknown? And they could have found out, or it's difficult to find out? Like, how far does the seller have to go?
Well,
Depends on what it is,
Yeah.
probably.
and it's probably going to be a discussion for them and their legal counsel to decide, an attorney's going to have to advise them on whether they have the ability to press the seller for saying unknown. Could they have had reasonable ability to have known it? So,
Was there a specific thought in mind, or just in general?
No, just in general.
Okay.
this is that form that's, in there for if they have to answer, a specific thing, it'd be a question number, probably the section in the letter. I would kind of wish it went by line. That would be
I know.
easier for me. But like, one of the questions on line 126 or 127 is, has the house had a full professional inspection or a pest and dry rot inspection in the last 3 years? So you got a yes. And then the answer might be, it was inspected when we bought the house 2 years ago. Maybe a copy of the report's available, maybe it's not, that kind of thing, okay? Has the roof leaked? Yes. Okay, it leaked, here's what we did to fix it, or, whatever else. Those are the kinds of things they'd be describing in here, okay? You got all of that information, and within your 5 business days after receiving that stuff, you decided, I don't want to buy it. Your buyer says they don't want to buy it. So you would use this form. And remember, what we're talking about here is notice. There are 3 opportunities for buyers to give notice and get out and get their earnest money back, no questions asked. The first one and the best one is this. Within our 5 business days of receiving the document, or maybe we didn't receive the seller property disclosure at all, we want out. We want to revoke and we get our earnest money back. That's basically what this document's going to say. The second one, and the second best, is the unconditional disapproval on the home inspection. So within that 10 business day period, and we'll talk about that one in a minute. The third is failure of financing contingencies. All 3 of those are notices. We don't need permission from the seller. We're just saying, we're done, here's why, thank you, and goodbye. So on this one, you're going to check that you received it on whatever date, or you never received it. And, if it's within that 5 business day window, then you would get it.
And notice there's not even a place for the seller to sign this.
Yeah, because it's only notice, so it's only the buyer giving notice. So, and then this, I believe, is talking about earnest money here, who holds the funds, when they were delivered, and so on.
And remember that an earnest money note is still earnest money.
Yep.
I get this quite a bit with new agents. They say, well, we don't have earnest money because we just wrote a promissory note.
Yep.
That is earnest money.
It's
That
still,
note needs to be voided and returned to the buyer.
right. So this is the second one. We've gone in and we've done our professional home inspection in our 10-day window, and we've asked for repairs, and this is the form that you'd be using to ask for those repairs. So, you're going to list out here the repairs, and I would say a good best practice for you would be to number those items. So it makes some level of simplicity for the seller and the seller's agent if they're going to choose to respond. You know, so on my last one, it was, you know, number one was, you know, install smoke alarm, carbon monoxide alarms as required by law, have the, you know, have a licensed HVAC, service the furnace and the air conditioner, repair or replace. Number three was repair or replace failed gas seal on the laundry room window. There were 3 or 4 other items, and we listed them all out by number, so that, and then the seller's response to us came back in a similar fashion. So there is a reminder here that, you know, there's a deadline to that inspection period. If we don't get these repairs worked out in that deadline, it's as if the buyer accepts the property as is, like we talked about last week. There's a spot here to say when the repairs should be completed by. So for me, that's usually somewhere in, you know, 5 to 10 days before closing is probably what I'm putting down as my deadline for that, something like that. I mean, I want to give the seller reasonable time to make the fix, but I also want my buyer to have a reasonable amount of time to re-inspect the property if that's what they want to do, because that ability is in here. You know, seller shall give buyer and buyer's agent written notice of completion of the corrective actions, and buyer may, with buyer's inspector, within blank business days. And they've got 2 as the option there, and I'll tell you 2 is probably not enough time. You probably want a few extra days in there, because how busy are our inspectors in this marketplace? You probably need more than a couple days to get them scheduled. Okay? So you have that ability, the buyer has that ability to go out and re-inspect and make sure the repairs are done. I had one recently where the seller had been asked to have licensed contractors do this, that, and the other, and they had had the licensed contractor do this, or maybe this and that, but not this, that, and the other. And so the buyer was saying, hey, wait a minute, you didn't do things the way we agreed to in the repairs. And we had a little bit of a debate, and that deal ended up dying. But without that re-inspection, they wouldn't have known until they owned the property. Okay? All right, so the buyers have asked for the repairs. The seller says, all right, I'll do some of these, but not all of them. And they're going to respond on the seller response to the repair addendum. So one thing to be careful with your sellers is lines 5 and 6. It says the seller makes the following counter proposal, and it says, note, unless modified, all other terms of the sales agreement and buyer repair addendum shall apply. So, you know, if you said on your repair addendum, I want 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 repaired, and the seller here says, I'll do 1, 3, 5, and 6, but they don't talk about those other ones that they're not doing, this is implying that they're still agreeing to do them. So you should be saying something like, seller will do 1, 3, 5, and 6, but they won't do, you know, 2, 4, and 7. There it is. Okay.
Yeah.
I remembered my numbers. Okay,
In other
good.
words, say what they will do and what they won't do.
Right. Okay? Clear as mud? Perfect. All right. So, and then, you know, this counter proposal, line 30, must be accepted by the buyer within a couple of business days. So there's some time limit to response. The buyers have the ability to accept or reject the seller's response to the repair addendums. So, okay, well, what if they want to make a counter proposal? Well, then you're probably going and getting a new buyer repair addendum, and you're starting over, with the exception of the fact that you know the seller's willing to do some repairs, and now you're going to have to ask them for those couple others that they didn't want to do that the buyer wants done.
So
Okay.
number them 1, 2.
Yeah, so this,
Whatever.
you know, the first one might have been repair 1, the second
Right.
one might be repair 2, something like that. Okay? All right.
And if you don't have room, use an addendum
Yep.
to go with it. And so call it repair addendum A or something like that.
Right. This is the form that is
Can
just,
I'm going to
go ahead.
mention one more thing here.
All right?
A seller is not required to even respond to you. So just know that as a new agent that you can send repair addendums all day long and the seller can ignore you and not even respond. act like they never even saw it. So you've got to watch your 10-day period or 5 days or 15, whatever period you've negotiated, and know that by your deadline, if you've not gotten a response from the seller and you've communicated with the agent, the seller may say, or the seller's agent may say, they're not gonna respond, then you have to have a conversation with that buyer. Do we want to terminate, or are you gonna accept it as is?
Yep.
So those are the only 2 options for your buyer at that time.
Yep, and that's why we talked about at the beginning of the class, knowing your timelines and knowing the deadline, but also, you know, knowing a couple of days ahead that you should have a conversation with that other agent. If you find out that information, they're not going to respond, then you've got time to have an informed discussion with your client and have them have time to maybe sleep on it or whatever else they're going to need to do to be at peace with either moving forward or killing the deal.
And I've also seen it happen to where a buyer can come back and say, well, I'll let these go, but if they become lender-required repairs, then I want them done.
Right.
Well, even if they come back as lender-required repairs, that's the buyer's financing failing. The seller still isn't obligated to do them just because the lender says they have to be done. That just means the lender's saying, you're not getting this loan unless you can get the seller or you to go in and do these repairs. So
if you get into some of these complexities, have a conversation with your
talking.
mentor,
Yeah.
or your reviewing broker, and don't wait till the last minute.
Yeah.
That's the message that I heard there.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is the form they're going to use to say, hey, we did the repairs.
Yeah,
And then down below is the spot where the buyer is going to sign saying, yeah, we looked them over and they look good. Everything's good. Okay, pretty simple form.
you guys should really use this one.
Yeah,
And I
we don't see that
it
used
very
enough,
much, but
no.
I use it on every one. That way I can't have a buyer come back and say, well, I didn't realize.
Yep. So here's that second notice document. We're given notice, we're out. So the buyers have had their inspections, one or more of the components. They've seen on something, one of those reports that came back, something that scared them or whatever, and they're giving notice of unconditional disapproval of the property. Okay? So,
And is this used in just the inspection, or can this also be used for the seller's disclosure?
no, this is for the inspections. Revocation and demand for earnest money is the one for seller disclosure.
Okay.
So this is the buyer's written notification to buyer or seller's agent of buyer's unconditional disapproval of the property based on one or more of the buyer inspection reports. Accordingly, buyer terminates the transaction. Buyer shall promptly provide copies of all reports to the seller only if requested by the seller. Now remember, PPG's policy is we want those documents, so we're going to request them. But anyways, you're going to fill in here that on whatever date, at whatever time, this notice was delivered to the seller or the seller's agent. So you're probably going to be checking seller's agent by the buyer or buyer's agent, most likely the buyer's agent. It's going to be a personal delivery, you handed it to them, a fax to the following phone number. Who uses a fax anymore? That line's probably going away soon. Or an electronic email, an email to this email address. Now there is a spot on this one for the seller to acknowledge, but it's only acknowledgement. So it doesn't change the fact that this is notice, and when the buyer signs this, this is done. So.
As long as it's within that 10-day period.
Well, this is
Right,
within
that's
that
the only
10-day
time
period.
I've seen that come up as a dispute because they both were counting days different.
Yep, which again is another thing about check those deadlines and send a copy to the other side and say, this is what I see as the deadlines, do you agree? If they say, no, I see something different, then you guys can discuss it. If they don't respond at all, then that kind of implies that, yeah, your timelines are fine and we're good. So, I mean, it certainly strengthens your argument that you've got the right count, okay? In this marketplace, we've got a lot of backup offers. So we've got multiple offers and sellers are taking one offer and putting another one in backup. So you'll probably have seen this backup offer addendum before too long. Remember, if you are working with the seller and you're planning to take a backup offer, you have to counter the offer into backup position, okay? You can't just accept the offer and send the backup addendum, that doesn't work. You've effectively sold the property twice, and that's bad for the seller, okay? So, you know, this basically spells out that this is an agreement to put this, you know, offer in backup position. You know, if the seller formally and completely terminates the first position one, then they'll notify these guys promptly in writing that they're automatically been moved to first position. So, you know, their timelines start when they've been given that notice and all of that stuff, okay?
What happens to the buyer's earnest money during a backup offer?
In a backup offer, typically they're not required to start giving it until they're notified of first position.
Okay.
So basically all your timelines in a backup offer are on hold. When you get notified you're in first position, then the clock starts ticking from that next business day.
Okay.
Okay? Okay. So, but the buyer also has the ability to give the seller notice that they're, you know, withdrawing from backup position. So that's in here too, okay? So that's your backup offer addendum. There you go. All right. Lead-based paint. Remember we talked in the sales agreement, now there's the lead-based paint addendum that is, you know, there's in the due diligence time period built into the sales agreement for homes built prior to 78 for them to conduct a risk assessment. Remember we talked last week, all the other due diligence timelines are based on business days. This one is based on calendar days, so remember to budget accordingly for that. You probably want some more time than what they're standardly offering. Thank you, federal government, for doing that for us, making it extra confusing. So there's a spot for the seller's agent to initial that they've notified the seller of their obligations to cooperate if the buyer wants to do a risk assessment. Then the seller needs to answer these two questions: whether or not they have any knowledge of lead-based paint or lead-based paint hazards. Either they have knowledge and they can describe it, or they have no knowledge. And then if they have knowledge, do they have any reports pertaining to what they knew about the lead-based paint hazards? Yes, they do, and they can describe them, or no, they don't. Okay? So this initial by the listing agent is required, and down here on line 29 is required. Well, line 28 says that the buyer's initial that they received whatever documents the seller said they had in question 2. Line 29 is where they initial saying, yes, we received a copy of the lead hazards in your home brochure, which we'll look at in a minute. So, and then the buyers have the ability to say, yes, I want to, you know, the option to do a risk assessment, or I can waive the opportunity to do a risk assessment. You know, they do have the ability to cancel if they don't like the results of their risk assessment. Okay? There's a spot for the buyers to sign, there's a spot for the sellers to sign, and the agents need to sign. This is a federal form, and like we talked about last week, it comes with a federal penalty, a big fat one, about 100 grand. So we're going to be pretty much sticklers about this one being fully complete, because I'm not writing out a check for 100 grand. Thank you.
I have a question.
Yes.
On line 28, in regards to obtaining the initials as to whether or not they've received the paperwork from
Right.
the sellers, if there is no paperwork, do we leave that blank?
Yeah. Yeah, so if they haven't received anything, you're going to leave that blank. So sometimes I see it initialed whether they've gotten information or not, but I mean, I suppose somebody could argue, well, we initialed acknowledging that we received the information and what we received was nothing. But if they didn't receive anything, you don't have to initial there. But they should receive this pamphlet from you, so they should be initialing you. Okay? Here's what the pamphlet looks like. It's in OREF, and I believe there's also a copy in the broker toolkit. We don't currently ask for this to be initialed, acknowledging that they received a copy like we do with Oregon agency pamphlet and stuff like that. That's probably the wave of the future, so you might maybe start proactively. I've got a couple agents who give this out and they put a copy in the file that, with the client's initials saying that they received it. So that might be a good practice for you to have. Okay, was there an on-site sewage system? Yes or no? Yes. Well, you get to fill out this addendum, aren't you lucky? All right, section 1 defines, it's the definition of on-site sewage systems. It's on the property, basically. Section 2 is a notice that, inspections need to be done by DEQ certified professionals. Section 3 is their representations. To the best of their knowledge, everything's working fine. There's section 4 talks about them providing whatever information they might have about the on-site sewage system, which is so many days. 3 is what's the standard default. And then you can ask for inspections. Inspections and tests. Maybe the seller pays, maybe the buyer pays. Pumping and cleaning, maybe the seller pays, maybe the buyer pays. Any other things? Inspecting the drain field, who's paying? So, the implication here is that all of these things are negotiable. The standard that Barb and I are seeing most often is, and I'm going to put it this way, which you'll forgive me, it's kind of crude, but the seller pays to pump their crap out, and the buyer pays to make sure that it will hold their crap when they own the property. That's kind of the standard. But, as you can see, there's options for either party to pay. And so I've had deals close where the buyer has asked the seller to pump and inspect. I've had deals close where the buyer has said, we'll pump and inspect. So, it just all depends on your negotiation tactics. Are you in a competitive situation for the property? Maybe the buyer's paying for both of these things to try and create an incentive to the seller. If you're in a non-competitive situation, maybe they're asking for the seller to pay for both. I've asked for the sellers to pay for both when I've worked with buyers and gotten it. I've asked for the seller to pay for both when I've worked with buyers and not gotten it. So, it can go either way. The buyer has the right to terminate the transaction if they don't like the results that they're seeing back on it. That's pretty much the high points of that one. Is there a private well on the property? Yes. Well, congratulations, you get this addendum. Just what you wanted, another form. So, again, there's some representations, from the seller regarding the well and well water. They're representing, to the best of their knowledge, that, it provides an adequate supply of water throughout the year for household use, that it's good for human consumption, and stuff like that, okay? With private wells, the seller, according to state law, has the responsibility to test the water to make sure that it's got good quality, that there isn't coliform bacteria and other, hazardous things in the water, okay, that's going to make people sick. The buyer has the ability to test the quantity, the flow, the gallons per minute the well produces. And some lenders will say that that's important to do. They want to know that there's a certain number of gallons per minute that well will produce. And sometimes they'll be unhappy if you don't have a certain productivity from the well. But this says that the seller is going to, within 5 business days is the standard, test the well for those contaminants. I can tell you from my experience, and Carrie, you work out in Newburgh, so you probably see a few more wells. I'm seeing that it takes longer than 5 days. Are you seeing something like that? Carrie snuck out on me, didn't she?
Talking about
all right.
Having the well flow and safety and everything tested.
Yeah.
So I've dealt with my second real property now, and it takes 2 or 3 or 4 days to even get the safety test to come back from the lab.
Right.
Much less get a guy to come out and actually do all the other tests.
Yep. So usually I'm putting something more like 10 or 15 business days on this. So 5 just isn't enough. So, and apologies for thinking you were Carrie over there, so. Buyer testing, you know, they've got the same 5 days. If I'm putting 15 on the seller side, I'm probably putting 15 on the buyer side. Sometimes you can find the same company that will come out and do both tests and then maybe divide the bill up, and that's the best scenario.
That's where I head for.
That's what I usually try to do too. But the buyer, just like every other, has the right to terminate within, you know, 3 business days of getting the results back. If they don't like the results, they can terminate the transaction. There is something in here about, you know, registering the well, which I believe is required by law when they're doing testing, if it's not already registered. So the seller needs to provide, you know, any of these information, so you would check the boxes that apply. You know, I'm usually asking for all of those, and hopefully they're going to give me that information. So sometimes they're going to tell you they don't have it. So, but then there's spots to check, you know, who's doing the well flow test and who's paying for it. So again, kind of like the on-site sewage system, it's a negotiable thing. You could ask the seller to pay for those flow tests. And if you're in a really competitive situation with multiple offers, maybe you're offering to pay for the quality tests. The buyer is. So, you know, actually I don't think the buyer has that option. The well flow test, they can ask the seller to pay, or these extra tests. The seller is automatically required to do the quality test. So, okay. That's the well one. Was there a wood-burning stove or a wood-burning fireplace insert in the property? Yes. Congratulations, you get an extra form.
Craig, real quick.
Yeah.
So what I just gathered from this then is the well test is not part of the 10-day inspection period.
No, it's a separate inspection period.
Okay.
So is the on-site sewage system.
Is that 5 days as well?
I believe so. I think that's what it said in there. So I'd go back and look, but we're running low on time, so I'm going to keep charging ahead. So it asks the same questions that are in the sales agreement. Is there a wood-burning stove or wood-burning fireplace insert on the property? Yes, no, or unknown. You know, so then you would talk about, you know, basically this is talking about the duties according to the law. You know, if there's a wood-burning stove or a wood-burning fireplace insert that's not DEQ certified, it has to be removed and destroyed before closing for any property sold after August 1st, 2010. You know, talks a little bit about the certificate label. A few occasions where they're exempt: pellet stoves, central fired wood furnaces, antique stoves, masonry fireplace, and masonry heaters. So removal and destruction, DEQ notification, so and there's some websites here where they can go get information. Section 5 gives the buyer the ability to take responsibility for removing that. I don't recommend that if you're working with the buyer. Let's leave the responsibility with the seller if we can, but there are going to be times, maybe you're working with a bank or something like that, where they're not going to do anything, where the buyer might have to assume that responsibility. So.
Question?
Yep. Go ahead.
Oh, how do you qualify an antique stove as an antique?
Well, we'd probably have to look at what I'm sure they just defined in the law, the guideline for it, and they probably said if it's built this year or earlier, it's determined to be an antique stove.
I know if there's no year on it.
Yeah, I don't know.
There's a couple of big stove places I've talked to a few times, and they're really good at this kind of stuff.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, so maybe you're having an expert come out.
1941 and earlier are considered antiques,
Okay.
so it doesn't matter what it is. Other
Yeah.
things I've learned with this, if it has a glass or a solid metal door, it's immediately not certified. Glass is potentially certified. Yeah.
And,
So if you're not 100% sure, you're probably calling an expert.
yeah.
So,
Is there a difference between a fireplace that doesn't have gas connection, like it's just a chimney?
right?
Is that what a wood-burning fireplace insert, or is that something different?
No, a wood-burning fireplace insert is enclosed. Your fireplace is going to be open.
Okay.
So when it's enclosed, it's a little bit more airtight. It's going to allow that to burn better and longer, that wood that's in there.
Okay.
And so, but, you know, still there's a DEQ quality that they're looking for those to be. that's higher than the ones that aren't DEQ certified, so
So homes that have an open fireplace.
They're
not a
fine.
problem. They're fine. That's just a fireplace.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And then, of course, there's more information, contacts down there and websites and all that stuff.
And it's not just in the home.
Yep.
It's one of these in anything on the property. So
Yep.
if they've got a shop out in the barn and they've got one of these out there and they're warming their space to work with that, it applies to that as well.
Yep. This is another form that's really handy that Barb and I don't see used all that often. Receipts of reports, removal of contingencies. So you can, it's a spot where you can say, we've received these reports and we're removing contingencies, or we're, you know, waiving contingencies. Some contingencies might be satisfied, that kind of thing. So this might be a spot where maybe if the home inspection contingency is satisfied, you're not going to ask for repairs. You could say the home inspection contingency on that line and it's considered to be satisfied. Maybe they decided not, they asked for a radon test and they decided not to do it. This would be where they might put in that they've waived that, okay? So, and then there's a spot for some additional clarifications. Maybe they've removed and satisfied some contingencies, but other contingencies are still in place and they want to clarify that those are still in place. This might be the spot where they would put that kind of stuff. So, it's a good form to start using if you can. So, please consider that. Because of our time situation, I'm going to skip over short sale stuff. If you've got a short sale going on that you're aware of, talk with your mentor, talk with your reviewing broker, and look through these forms and then ask us some questions. We'll get you some clarification. Contingent right to purchase. We'll spend a little bit of time here. Okay. So remember from our conversation last week, we talked about contingent source of funds, and one of those sources is I'll buy this house, but I gotta sell my house over on 123 Main Street and get that closed, and then the money can transfer over here, okay? And so the seller might have said, fine, but we're gonna, do this contingent right to purchase addendum. They countered and said, we're gonna add this contingent right to purchase addendum to the agreement, and that allows the seller to go into bumpable status in the multiple listing system.
Which means the seller can continue to
Market the
house.
property for sale, yes, thank you. So,
It's not pending yet.
right. This agreement is contingent upon the sale and closing of the buyer's real property at 123 Main Street. The buyer has until 5 p.m. on whatever date to give the seller notice that they've, got a sale, got a buyer on the property, okay? And so they're gonna give one of these notices. They're gonna say that the alternative one, that the buyer has accepted an offer on the buyer's property and, agrees to keep the seller informed, removes all contingencies related to the sale except the closing of the sale of buyer's property. And, and then to notify the seller if the offer on the buyer's property terminates for any reason, that kind of stuff. They could choose alternative 2, where the buyer has listed buyer's property for sale but does not have an accepted offer. And I think at that point they're basically saying we're going to move forward without the sale of our property is what they're trying to do there. So if the buyer does not give the seller written notice of alternative 1 or alternative 2 by that deadline date that was up above, then the contingency deadline to this transaction is automatically terminated, and the parties kind of go their separate ways at that point, okay? Then there's a spot here to spell out the, timelines for contingencies. What are we doing? Are we commencing our inspections and earnest money deposits and stuff like that under the first option on line 47, which would be the next business day following this sales agreement being signed, or what happens most often, line 48 is checked and you're commencing the next business day following the date the buyer gives written notice, selecting alternative 1 or alternative 2. Okay, so they're going to get their buyer lined up, and then they're gonna give their notice. That's what's gonna happen most often, and that's when their timelines will start counting. Okay? Timelines for closing and possession will be, closing will be blank business days after the buyer gives that written notification of alternative 1 or alternative 2. Okay? Possession will be blank calendar days following the date of closing. And then any additional provisions to this contingency agreement. Sometimes one of the things I saw recently as an additional provision was the buyers cannot accept contingencies on their property that they're selling. So we don't want a contingent on a contingent thing, okay? Questions? Good. I've scared them into silence, perfect. All right. So this would be the form that the seller would be using to say, hey buyer, while you've been looking for a buyer to buy your house, we got another offer on our house, okay? So you've got that, you've got, you know, whatever your contingency time was in the previous document, we didn't highlight that particularly, but it's either 24 or 48 or 72 hours, whatever's filled into the appropriate blank. But they've got that amount of time to, you know, either move forward or back out, is basically what this document is saying, okay? And so there's a spot down here for the buyer to say, hey, no, we're going to do alternative 1. We got a buyer for our place. Or, no, we're going to do alternative 2. We don't have a buyer, but we're just going to purchase and close. Or termination. We don't have a buyer, and so we can't move forward, and so we're going to cancel and get out of the way. Okay? And then there's this other notice that the buyer is giving to the seller, hey, we got a buyer. Hooray for us. Or we're moving forward without a buyer. We found another way to buy your house without having to have ours sold and closed. Okay? And then a spot for the seller to acknowledge, hey, great news. We're moving forward. Okay? Contingencies can be a little bit of a tricky thing, so if you're getting into one of those as a new agent, talk to your mentor. Talk to your reviewing brokers about those. Make sure that you're clear on those, because you want to disclose them properly, and as Carrie mentioned in an email that she sent out to the mentors recently, I mean, we've seen scenarios where it's been contingent on the sale of a house, but the mentee forgot to write in that it was contingent on the sale of a house, which is a problem. And so now you got to fix it, and you might be putting your buyer at risk if you don't put that right verbiage in there the first time around, okay? So talk with your support team before you just jump into those. Do we have a townhouse or a planned community? Well, guess what? Yes, we do, and congratulations, you've got another addendum to fill out. So basically, this is an opportunity for the seller to deliver to the buyer all the documents, you know, the CC&Rs, the homeowner association agreements, the rules and regulations, maybe meeting minutes for the meetings that are being held and stuff like that, information on contacts, what parking spaces, storage spaces, HOA dues, you know, basically a spot for the seller to tell the buyer what they know about that homeowners association or townhouse planned community, okay? And so I mean, we get stuck on the townhouses, the ones that are attached to other houses, but this is also communities that have homeowners associations. So if they've got a little $20 a month homeowner association to maintain the front yard, needs this addendum. If they're up on Bull Run or Persimmon over in Gresham and you got one of these several $100 a year homeowner associations, you know, you're using this addendum even for those detached single family houses, okay?
If there's an HOA, do you always do one of these?
If there's an HOA that's collecting money, you probably should.
Unless it's a condo.
Unless it's a condo, then you're using the condo sales agreement. Okay? Mm-hmm.
I feel like I've run into the situation where, and I've never really gotten a straight answer, like the HOA demand that's being charged $260 or $275, whatever the number is. Is this all stuff that the seller can get just by asking, or are they paying for it, or is it always different?
As far as all those documents,
Yeah, all the documents, but then again, on top of it, the HOA demand that escrow's usually getting.
No. should come from the seller.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah,
and so then the escrow demand is
The
just the
only thing
payoff
that,
amount, right?
yeah, the only
Right.
thing that escrow's could get for you would be the CCNRs.
right.
Okay, and then
The
payoff-
recorded, but everything, and yeah,
So
right.
the HOA
And
demand
whether or
is
not they
payoff.
owe dues or whatever, you're correct.
Right.
Okay,
But everything else comes from the seller.
okay,
Yep.
and then do they usually have to pay for that, or is that usually?
That's
free
their
to them?
problem.
It just depends, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, it depends on the homeowners association.
Yeah.
A lot of them now, probably maybe even all of them, are charging to supply those documents.
And here's what they're saying. You have had, most of them have a website with a login now, and they can go in and get their own. Or we've been sending you minutes, we've been sending you information every month. If we're gonna duplicate all this, you're gonna pay us to do
Okay.
that.
Okay.
Right, right. Okay. Let's see what else I've got here. Okay, we couldn't work out all the details, and so we're gonna have to say goodbye to each other. We're doing the termination agreement. Now, this should be the last line of defense. Remember, we got those 3 notices that we're doing. The revocation of the seller, based on the seller property disclosure, we're getting out. The notice of unconditional disapproval. Notice the buyer's failure to financing. That's probably the one spot where maybe you're using this, but you're also doing an addendum that says, this is notice the buyer was given notice by the lender that they failed to qualify for financing, or the home failed to qualify, or whatever. See attached letter from the lender about that, and then you're gonna also do this termination agreement, okay? But beyond those 3 things, there shouldn't be a lot of times that you're using this form, so I mean, you might even be double checking with your mentor if it's the right time to use it. But it's, it spells out that, the earnest money in the form of blank has been deposited wherever it's been. Either, the title company is most likely. This talks about everybody's gonna hold each other harmless as we walk away from each other, except for whatever's written in that yellow line, and that line is most typically blank. We're all walking away. We're not holding any last bits of stuff. We're gonna take action against each other. A notice to escrow to cancel and disperse the earnest money as follows. Whatever the earnest money amount is to, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, the buyer, or, Mr. and Mrs. Doe, the seller, whatever. So, and sometimes it might be that some of it's going to the buyer and some of it's going to the seller. So, okay?
Are you using this to terminate under the contingent right to purchase?
Probably. I mean, you're gonna start with an addendum or something like that that says, the buyer, the parties agreed to terminate the transaction based on, failure of the contingent right to purchase agreement or something like that. So you're gonna kind of need to explain it. The state wants us to explain why is a deal dying. And so you're gonna have an addendum or some sort of notice that explains why the deal's dying. And then where necessary, you're gonna have a termination agreement.
Right, so if the timelines did start day after acceptance,
Right.
and there was dispersing funds
Yeah,
to use this one?
yeah, or the promissory note.
Okay.
So, because you might still just be holding that note and it
And
died
it
so
could be
quickly.
that maybe escrow in that situation wasn't ever even open.
Okay.
Right,
So talk to your reviewing broker or your mentor if it comes to that one, because this might not always be used.
Okay.
It might just be an agreement that
yeah.
you didn't get a sale and now it's dead.
I think Kelly kind of even prefers that we use our notices or our addendums explaining things wherever possible.
Right.
And use escrow's cancellation instructions
But if they never.
instead of this.
Right.
Mhm.
And if they never opened an escrow, there isn't gonna be one.
Right. I'm sure you've all seen at least one of these, but this is the standard addendum to the real estate sales agreement. It's a whole lot of blank space where you can put in a whole lot of information to clarify details in the course of the sales agreement that you're doing, okay? I'd say be a little bit careful when you're using this. I mean, if you're putting in a lot of stuff and filling up a lot of those blank lines, you're getting on the verge of acting like an attorney. So just try and keep it down to simple things. Closing date is changed to blank. Sales price is changed to blank. Just little little shots, okay? So, but if you're starting to write in, this is gonna do this, and this is gonna do that, and as a result, this is gonna come here, and all the parties agree to blah, 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 talk to your mentor and talk to your reviewing broker before you get too much of that stuff. Because ideally, it should all be in your agreement already, and you shouldn't be changing a whole bunch of stuff. I think we saw a promissory note last week, but just in case, there it is again. Now it's going to talk about the buyers, the sellers, the amount. That amount's going to get paid to, and most often we're going to say it's going to get paid directly to the title company within blank business days or calendar days. So it does have some talking here about failure to pay. If the buyer fails to pay on a timely fashion, this note can be signed over to the seller for the purposes of collecting, and the transaction that we had going is void. If they fail to pay, it's voidable. Okay? I think that's it for those. The only other thing to look at real quick is we're going to look at in, get it to open, we're going to look at the Oregon PPG buyer's disclosure. So for the most part, the buyer disclosure is about just general notification informations for the buyer to be aware of. It's going to say that the schools are deemed, that schools that are represented in the multiple listing system are deemed accurate, but property boundaries, boundary lines for schools and stuff like that change. So the buyers want to talk with the school district, verify that they're going to be in the school that they want to be in. This talks about, we really recommend that they get a home inspection, the value of a home inspection, the use of experts and contractors. So, and it also says down here that we provide a list of experts and contractors, but if they use somebody from that list, we strongly encourage them to verify with the CCB their standing, make sure their license is in good standing, and here's the website where they can go and check that out, okay? Here's a list of some, but not all, of the inspections that are available to a buyer if they choose. The importance of radon gas testing, that it's been deemed that, living in this area and, that there's a certain amount of radon gas that's been emitted, and that, the government has deemed that to be a cancer-causing agent, and they might want to check to make sure that it's, whatever the radon limit is in their house is within the acceptable range. Once again, the MLS and website information that they've seen about the property is deemed to be accurate, but that's not guaranteed, so they need to verify anything that's important to them. That they're going to be responsible for reviewing the preliminary title report and any covenants, conditions, and restrictions, and making sure that everything on there is looking good, okay? That we're going to prepare a market analysis and help them to see what the value is for the property that they're buying on. That an appraisal is different from a home inspection. They're looking for completely different things. Another reason that we prefer that they do a home inspection. Here's a link to the Oregon Buyer Advisory. So the things that, that have been deemed important for buyers to be aware of when they're purchasing. Here's a paragraph that says that if they're buying a bank-owned property or new construction, those entities are probably using their own forms. They're not our standard OREF documents. And so we're not experts in those documents. And so if they need extra explanation about what those documents say, they need to hire legal counsel to explain it to them, because we're not experts. Something about the importance of the manufactured homes, just basically talking about that we're not, an expert in all the aspects of manufactured homes. We know a little bit about selling manufactured homes on land, but they should be checking with independent experts. We do have in the broker toolkit the manufactured home buyer advisory, which we won't be looking at today. So if you want to see it, you can go find it. This is a notice that we did not solicit them away from another realtor to work with us, that they chose to work with us independent of any other, agents they were working with. A notice that tenant regulations are changing. We heard a lot of talk this year about landlord-tenant law and some of the possible impacts. This says to them that they need to be keeping track of those things. If landlord-tenant law is something that's going to impact their purchase, they need to investigate what kind of impacts it's going to have. A spot for them to acknowledge that they've received the Oregon Agency Disclosure Pamphlet, the lead pamphlet that we talked about today, and any home warranty brochures that you've shared with them. So this is also a reminder to you, home warranties are a good thing. They might be something you want to pass out to your clients and give them an opportunity to choose to use. On the seller side, real quick, and then we'll be wrapping up. There's a notice here that under Oregon law, they need to have smoke alarms and smoke detectors that meet the law. That means they need to have a push button hush feature, and they need to have a long life lithium ion battery. And what we've seen inspectors saying more recently is they also need to be not older than 10 years old. So be aware of that. There is a link for them to go and check that stuff out. It also talks about carbon monoxide alarm requirements, and that law that was passed in 2011. Hard to believe it was so long ago. Permissions for internal or interior virtual tours. So, you know, it talks about how thorough and how high quality our virtual tours are. If they want to exclude any rooms for any reasons, they would want to put them on this blank line there. I had a gun collector that didn't want a particular room that he stored all his guns in videotaped. So we, wrote it on the line, excluded that room from our photography and video tours. This just talks about, we're going to do a market analysis when we help them establish a value for their property, but that's not an appraisal. So we are not licensed appraisers establishing, value like they do. Notice again about the changing regulations and tenants that they need to, check and find out how those are going to impact them. An addenda to the listing contract. The seller requests that all offers be presented through the listing broker. So whether you know it or not, you have the right to present your buyer's offers directly to the seller. Of course, the other agent's going to be there, but you have that opportunity. Most of our agents don't choose it. And this, on the seller side, says we're not going to do that. The seller wants us, the offer sent to us as the listing agent, and we're going to present it to them, okay? A reminder of the use of experts and contractors. If they need to have repairs done to the house they're selling, we have a list of contractors, and they have the ability to go and check to make sure that they have good CCBs, kind of like on the buyer side. Another notice to the seller this time that we didn't solicit their listing away from another realtor. They chose to work with us on their own accord. And then a spot for signing and agent signatures and stuff like that. Okay. That's pretty much it for action items today. You've got to read the OREF forms and matrix usage, practice writing a few of these, adding and writing a few of these OREF addendums, counteroffers, maybe repair addendums, some of those things. And also go into the broker toolkit and pull out the PPG broker compensation demand and practice writing a demand that you're going to send to escrow to get paid. Because we should know how to fill out the get paid form, right? Okay. Any questions about the stuff we've discussed today in general? All right, we're a little bit after, so thanks for staying a little bit extra with me. You guys have a great day.